Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm Stéphan Vincent-Lancrin. I'm the Deputy Head of Division at the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills and a Senior Education Economist. One of the things I do, and that what I'm going to talk about is work on innovation in general, but on digitalization in particular. And as you may know, the digital transformation is one of the big OECD priorities across all sectors of the OECD. And of course, it's also one that is very important in the case of education. So what I'm going to talk about is very much related to the work we've been doing on AI and digital technology in education for the past few years and what we have in the pipeline as well. So, we've started with work on the frontiers of technology, looking at AI, blockchain, social robots, etc. in 2021, before the emergence of generative AI. So it was at the time, and also actually we started the work before COVID, even so it was published just after it started. And then continued on work which is more related to countries' infrastructure in terms of digital education and also how they govern the education sector, the digital part of the education sector. And so with 2 volumes that came out on that was the topic of the Digital Education Outlook 2023. And we have also something which is more country-specific, a companion volume, as we've called it. And what we are currently working on and what will be the next edition of the Digital Education Outlook will be work on generative AI and, so basically the promises for education and the possible pitfalls. And so I'm going to talk about all these different aspects, looking at how, AI can help to improve learning through student-facing tools, teacher-facing ones, in the management aspects, and then finish with where countries stand and, give you a little bit of information about some work we've been doing, guidelines on AI, what we're currently working on for generative AI, and, our the AI literacy framework as well. So when we're talking about AI in education, we have in mind a lot of different types of tools, and really going from student information systems, early warning systems, etc. But also a lot of them are for teaching and learning. And of course, generative AI is one of the possibilities for that. But, working on AI, what you usually find is that what people have in mind when we talk about AI is ChatGPT and other similar tools. And, I would like to remind ourselves that, we have basically different types of AI and some which are specialized, and so like intelligent tutoring systems, for example, which is here considered to be a conventional or, what some people call the good old-fashioned or predictive AI. You have educational Gen AI, for example, Socratic large language models. You have specialized research tools as well. And all the tools like, that we typically have in mind and actually for which there is currently the most research, including in education, are so-called, generative or general purpose Gen AI tools. So we have to make these distinctions, and I will try to, show you the different aspects of it. So when we talk about generative AI, ChatGPT seems to be really one of the top. And when I say that, chatbots like it, similar to it, and it's kind of 95% apparently of the use of it, and a little bit for image and very little for tools. So that was last year, but probably hasn't changed that much since then. What we know is that students already use it, university students, so here that's on the left-hand side, the non-representative study showing that almost all students actually use it in their studies. And on the right-hand side is one country, it's France, and we start having actually some information for also Germany, Switzerland, and a few other ones, showing a pretty high level of use. And perhaps here the amusing thing is that, so that's a representative survey, and of course there is a little discrepancy between what students say, how much they say they use generative AI, and how much their teachers believe or professors believe they actually use it. But what we know is that it has evolved and it probably is continuing to do so. So here that's in the US, where we have two data points, which are also based on representative samples. And you can see that, it went from 33% in 2023, fall 2023, and then 6 months later, we were already at over 70% for teachers, school students, undergraduate students, and also parents, so that, it's a very widespread adoption of generative AI and AI for education. We've just released at the OECD the TALIS 2024, so that's the Teacher and Learning International Survey, and where we had questions about the use of AI in teaching, for teachers. And here we're talking about middle school teachers. And you can see that, we had about 36% who say that you have very big discrepancy across country, going from 13% in France to 75%. You can see actually looking at the previous graph on the US was showing that we were about 70% or for and 40% of regular use for teachers. Here it's 42% in the case. So that, of course, there are different ways of interpreting some of these views. There is actually an interesting, strong agreement with teachers that so it helps them to write and improve their lesson plans. They agree with that, that it can allow to adapt personalized learning materials for students, or that can help to automatize some of the administrative tasks. But interestingly, they're also quite critical, and they realize that, in fact, it can also come with risk. And I would say there is also a high level of proportion of teachers across the world, on average, that are fully aware of that. What we know about the use of these tools is that in many cases, it's really used in majority to basically as a search engine, and to provide information, a little bit on explaining, so that you can actually feel that people probably use them as a learning tool as well. But, and interestingly, actually, well, perhaps one of the risks that we can see, that it would perform the entire task for students or for teachers is about 1/3 of them, so we can discuss whether it's high or not so high, but that's really, of course, one of the uses, but not the most common. So let's do how, some aspects of how it can actually improve teaching and learning. So if we go to conventional or to non-generative AI, of course, there is all the use for assistive technologies, to diagnose dysgraphia, for example, to help with dyslexia, to new types of tools that actually make graphs readable for people with a visual impairment. You have all the intelligent tutoring system, the digital tutors in their different ways, which can adapt at the task, unit, or a curriculum domain level. But I think what's most important is that they really provide a tool to do and to learn things that you couldn't easily learn before. So here, that's an example of composing software that some of us have in their mobile phone, or can be used in tablets, but you have a lot of different ones. And what it allows you to do, if you're a music teacher, is to actually make your students write a song, for example, and understand music, how repetition is important, how you add different tracks, etc., in ways that is almost impossible to do in a real live class, because your students don't play an instrument, they cannot read music, and so that really opens a lot of new possibilities. And I would say that's a music example. I could have taken one in science, and that would also be true for some aspects of it. On the generative AI front, a lot of new possibilities as well, depending on how it is used, for brainstorming, providing feedback, translating, generating first sketches of different images, for example, etc. But of course, there is new challenges that also come with it. And which very much depend on the levels of education in some ways, but also the level of expertise that people have in the field. Now they've been integrated as part of digital tutors or intelligent tutoring systems. And so here that's an example, Cadmigo, but you have a lot of different types, which actually provide a new type of interface to interact with these tools without changing necessarily, how it actually works. So what do we know about their effect on learning? So we have a few studies, and so that here, that's a pretty strong one because it has a relatively big sample, which was actually carried out in Turkey for mathematics. And it's a randomized control trial for high school students, middle high school students, where basically they were initially taught, the math content that they had by the teacher. And then they were asked to practice what they were taught in 3 different ways. Just the traditional way, you take your notes and your textbook and you do your exercises, or you could have use a chat GPT or a kind of a GPT, a generic GPT, that's the GPT base, or you could have actually a Socratic GPT that wouldn't give you the answer, but actually would help you to reach this answer. And at the end of the day, all the groups take the same test. So those who had access to a large language model do not have access to it anymore. And so what do we find for that? Well, when they practice, those who actually have the educational GPT perform much, much better than the other ones. And those who also have the generic one perform better than those who don't. And you can see, but you can see on the exam results, when you actually remove the GPT, then you can find that those who had the educational GPT do exactly the same as those who didn't have access to any GPT, and those who actually had the generic one do worse. So that means that possibly the students were engaged in the practice, but what they were doing in many cases was that they were offloading some of their tasks to the tool. And interestingly, there was strong engagement, of students during practice mode, so that there was actual practice that was going on. And the misrepresentations were not due, that was checked by the researchers, they were not due to the ChatGPT or the large language model providing wrong answers in the practice session. I mean, of course, it may have, but it wasn't the main reason why it happened. Second example, which actually, was done by Fan and colleagues, and here that's something which is tested in the case of essay writing, where here the focus is more on the cognitive processes that actually are happening when people do use different kind of tools. So here, the researchers compared the motivation, self-regulating learning processes, and learning performance on a writing task. So basically, everyone writes their first essay by themselves. So, it's not offloaded to any tool. But then when it comes to revision, they can do it in 4 different ways, either entirely by themselves. They can ask a human expert that will support them. They can work with a generative AI, or they can actually have a checklist and some tools to see what they should be improving. And so that's with higher education students. So what did the colleagues find for that one? Well, there was, interestingly, the one who were using a more interactive method, so which were not on their own, were slightly more motivated than the other ones. Those who had the AI had actually the best score, so they had the best performance in terms of the final essay that they have provided. However, in terms of knowledge, so here again, if you don't have the tool, then there was actually no difference across the different groups, which means that the higher performance of those who had the AI tool didn't correspond to an increase in knowledge. And so, one of the possibility for that is basically that there was some risk of metacognitive laziness in their thinking process because they did a bit less of evaluation and orientation tasks when, the researchers looked at what they were doing. And so they outsource much more of their thinking to the machine in many ways. And so that's really one of the big concerns with the use of, and especially generative AI and generic tools for generative AI. So that's an other study which, with some of the same researchers, so that, in the same vein in some ways, which is also to look at what are the cognitive processes that we use when we use these kind of tools. And so here that was actually about, for Chinese native speakers to write an essay in English. And then they could again revise them with two conditions, either with ChatGPT or by seeking help of a human expert. And the big question was, how would they actually reach this result, with these two different conditions. And so they were tracking different types of activities, like diagnosing the question, asking for help, evaluating the help that they were receiving, and then actually processing it. And what they found is that basically the human groups are working with another human did follow the kind of the help-seeking theory. So they were diagnosing, what question they had to ask, asking for help, then they received some help, evaluating the help, sometimes had a little bit of loop with that, and then actually process that help. And that was a kind of a relatively linear process, which was quite different for those who use the large language model, because they were actually in some ways much more pragmatic, and they were much more in the tinkering mode, where they had much more of a circular strategy of using it. So that that shows that indeed, when we use these tools, we don't necessarily have the same process, and that we perhaps rely less readily on our brains when we do that, which is actually a problem for learning. Does it mean that there is no way that generative AI is very dangerous and there is no way that we can learn with it? Well, that would be very surprising, that you have a tool that allows you to do a lot of things, to brainstorm, to have access to knowledge that you can consult, and then you never learn anything using it. So probably that's not true, but still there is a challenge on how we can actually learn when we have access, and especially if we're not fully sure that we have the motivation to do that. So let me show you a couple of other studies. This one is about creativity and communication. So basically, it's again a writing task, and students, so I think it is in the UK, it's not mentioned in the paper, but we're asked basically to write short stories, creative ones, with and without Gen AI. But again, here, everyone writes their own story. So the difference is that, and it's a very short story, it's a story of 16 sentences, so very short. And what, some had to do it by themselves. Others could actually ask Gen AI for one idea, and which was actually the first sentence of the story. So that could be an idea, or they could actually ask for 5 different ideas, and it was actually 5 times the first sentence of the story, so, and then it was evaluated by human beings and rated for creativity and the quality of the actual story. And so what do you find in that case? Well, the dashed line is for the human alone. And you can see that, if you have access to one Gen AI ID, then you do better in terms of novelty and usefulness, which are the 2 criteria of creativity. You also do better if you have 5 IDs, and you do better than if you just have one. So at the end, on average, they found that those who had access to the Gen AI tools had much more creative outputs. And I shall add that compared to what we saw before, it was, they had a more creative human written output, so that was by using just brainstorming to some extent with the Gen AI tool. And also they found that the quality of the stories were also better, they were better written, more enjoyable, surprising, less boring, but also less funny, so that was where it's changed a little bit. However, interestingly, what they found is that all the stories that were generated using, those who had Gen AI, ended up having less originality, so that they were more similar to one another and had much less variety, which implies, and perhaps not surprisingly, that when you use these kind of tools, even so you may learn something and improve your performance, it also comes at some cost. And here it's a collective cost, in terms of collective originality. Second example is colleagues in Slovenia who, in a programming course, which try to change actually the way that they teach in higher education to their students by getting one group without accessing Gen AI at all and the other one to access it, and then try to see if they could actually twist their course in such a way that it wouldn't make any difference if you have access to the generative AI or not. And so basically that was, the use for the practical assignments. So you can see the course structure, 15 weeks, they had a lot of practical assignments, 11 mandatory and 11 optional ones. And then they had every week a lab session where they had another assignment, and interestingly, where they had to do an oral defense of their home program, so that they had to actually explain what they did, even if they did it with a generative AI. And then they had two paper-based midterms. So, it was all a paper and pencil and with no access to computers. And what they found is that indeed they ended up having the same results for both groups on the lab work and also on the exam. Even so, the ChatGPT group had the impression that they had learned more than the other one. And the way that they've done it was actually by revising assignments. So first, ChatGPT proofing to some extent the assignment that they were giving, really using the lab session as an extension of home assignments, so that in fact it was a derivative of what they had to do before, and here they couldn't do it actually with the ChatGPT tool. And then having this oral defense, which were focused on conceptual questions, the analysis of the code, the asking people, so what would, if they change their code, what would be the minimal change it could have to have a big impact or small impact, etc. And then, of course, the midterm exams, because they were paper-based, were mainly of theoretical questions, a format which they note annoyed some of the students. But here, the question is, if we can actually learn something with using ChatGPT, I think that if you can use it, it's even better, because you also learn to use ChatGPT in the process of doing that. So, but what it shows is that we have to review our assignments, our pedagogical methods, and probably this is one of the challenges that, we will have in the years to come. How do we actually make that in a proper way? So that's some of the takeaways, a lot of possibilities with AI. When we use AI, and students tend to perform better when they do that, but of course it doesn't mean that they learn more or that they learn at all, or that, it doesn't come with some costs as well. So one of the limitations of the studies I've shown, is basically that for most of them, apart from the Slovenian one, they tend to use the current kind of paths that we give in education, whereas probably we should try to give things which are, for example, more complex and more difficult to do, or difficult to do if we hadn't the support of a Gen AI tool. Also, all of these studies are actually evaluating generative AI tools rather than educational ones. And so we still haven't very strong studies on those to see what are their effects on learning. And so perhaps one of the conclusions of that at this stage is basically that we may want to learn and assess with and without generative AI, like an open and closed book kind of exams and learning, so that we can develop the AI literacy that will be needed in our world, but also that we can actually learn something and get the foundations to be able to correct what the machine is doing for us or with us. Now, let's move to more teacher-facing tools, and it's a bit kind of the same. There is a lot of very exciting things for non-generative AI. I personally have a liking for the classroom analytics tools. So here on the left-hand side, you have one which kind of transforms the classroom into a dashboard, with these green and orange and red lamps, where that indicate to the instructor where who he should actually support. On the right-hand side is a tool for regulating dialogue in teamwork, and you can see that each one see how much time they have actually spoken. And so here it's possible that the woman on the right-hand side has presented what the subject was, but it's also possible that she hasn't, and then there is some catch-up that is needed by the one opposite her. Here, that's a tool that is actually an observation tool, which provides information to the teacher on when they spend their time. And so here you can see that, she spent a lot of time at her desk, and then a lot of time on the left-hand side of the classroom, and not so much on the right-hand side. And so there might be a lot of good reasons for that, but it's really a reflection tool for the teachers themselves, about their practice. And in the real case, in the real life scenario, the teacher was quite surprised that she spent so much time on the left and not so much on the right. Or, you have these tools which help you to see how you have spent your time, so in terms of explaining, questioning, monitoring, etc. So that could be a lot of very useful tools with non-generative AI. With generative AI, we know that we have a lot of applications, lesson plans, contextualizing, as I've mentioned before, with Talis, providing more detailed feedback to students with the help of a tool, generating quizzes, exercises, assessments, and also scoring according to a rubric, which, as we know, is something which is a very time-consuming task if we do it without any help. So we have examples here. That's an example from China, where it's basically an example of micro-teaching with the integration of simulations and generative AI. So as you know, micro-teaching is when in teacher education, the students actually teach their fellow students, and showcase the lesson. And so here they just do it in a simulated environment and with a virtual teaching assistant, with a Gen AI one, which also supports them in responding to the reaction of the students. And so here there is no evaluation of the effectiveness of the tool, but just actually on the design of the tool, which was well received by the students overall. One of the strongest studies that we have is about this Tutor Copilot, a tool that was designed by colleagues at the University of Stanford, and where basically they were in a digital learning, digital tutoring platform. They, provided an assistant tool which was designed following a long ethnographic work with teachers in terms of how do you give actually good feedback to your students. And so they have actually more or less experienced human tutors who supported US students, K-12 students from underserved populations. And so what they found is basically that the use of the tool to support them in giving the feedback to the students. So here again, they are in an online platform, so they don't really see each other, show that the use of the tool brings those who were considered to be of lower quality tutors or less experienced tutors more or less to the same level as those who are actually high quality tutors, and also that it doesn't have much impact for those who are already strong students. And so here that's the same, but based on the level of experience of the tutors, and you can see the effect is more or less the same. And why is it the case? Basically, it is because with the use of the tutor, the tutors use more of the effective tutoring strategies than when they actually don't have access to it. So also for teaching, AI opens a lot of possibilities, so as I've mentioned, to orchestrate the teaching in real time, also have, to provide post-prod feedback on their practice, to support them in training, to actually upgrade the performance of more inexperienced tutors, and a lot of other possibilities whose effect have not been really tested in terms of the quality, but which works in terms of productivity. There were some studies in England showing that the teachers doing their lesson plans gained like 30% of time, and actually for the quality of the lesson, which was more or less the same as before. But on that, we really don't have enough research yet on what is the impact of the use. So one of the arguments for it is to say that, it allows the teachers to actually spend more time on the most important aspects of the teaching relation, like the personal relation with the students. Of course, there is also risk, the same risk as for the students. First, that they don't learn as much in terms of professional learning, and so they don't become from inexperience to experience, that they don't learn as much as they would have, or not at all, possibly, but also that actually they lose the human relation that they have with the students. For example, some people tell me that, generative AI is wonderful for marking essays or grading because that's an administrative task. But in fact, no, that's not an administrative task. It is a very important teaching task. And if you want to have a connection with your students, you must do it, So I'm not saying that you have to do it all the time, but you must do it, and you must know how your students are doing and have a first-hand knowledge of it. So last but not least, and I'm going to go fast on that one, is also the use of it for institutional and system management, which is something that is, of course, important for education policymakers as well. So in terms of non-generative AI, we have longitudinal information systems, which are really good and which can now be coupled with learning analytics, or not learning, but analytics, and so at the individual level, it can be related to diagnosis tools about where, given the history, the students should be or should have been, and giving that information to students. And that's actually the same idea with early warning system that try to identify students who are at risk of, for example, dropping out from high school, and then to trigger a human intervention. And of course, it matters mainly when it's not obvious that it is going to happen. But it is not always obvious, because the research on that showed that there are a lot of students who actually are not visibly at risk of dropping out, and who end up dropping out. So that's really one of the lessons of all this research. And in terms of generative AI, so here we could take, as at the OECD, we do PISA and we do standardized assessments for a few things. In PIAC as well, the survey of adult skills. And one of the use case for generative AI is actually the generation of assessment items. And so here, that's an example of that, where based on a lesson summary, GPT-4 was asked to generate a few exercises and items. And if you look at those who were actually done by ChatGPT, or those who were done by the humans, the difficulties, the distribution of difficulty is about the same. And what is interesting, so that we have generation that's worked pretty well, the one by ChatGPT resembles very much the other one. However, when you do you look at principal component analysis, you find that the ChatGPT are the red dots, so that a bit like in the creativity example I've mentioned before, you have a lot of the universe that is not explored when it is ChatGPT compared to what you have when it is done actually by the human being. So here again, perhaps something is lost in the process. Even so, at face value, it's pretty good and can actually really help to do these things. So here again, Gen AI, a lot of possibilities, and especially on the efficiency side, but also opening a new source of possibilities. For example, in the use, the understanding of learning analytics, making, for example, dashboards not a static instrument, but something that can be questioned through a more chatbot and a more interactive interface. There are a few caveats, it's AI sometimes may or may not perform as well as humans, so that's the other thing. Generative AI may or may not perform as well as good old-fashioned AI tools. In fact, a lot of studies show that the conventional ones or the old ones work better, than the generative AI. Even so, it has the advantage of being more easily repurposed and more versatile. And then, especially for all of these tools, one of the big issues is really the social acceptance, because you should think of exams, assessments, the way that people are admitted in universities or in high schools, etc. We have already built standards, and which are sometimes difficult to challenge with all these new tools. So where do countries stand with all that? Well, what we've seen before is that a lot of possibilities are open thanks to, and that's what we have explored in what I've been talking about right now, because a lot of these things are not always deployed. And in 2023, we looked at what were people actually doing, and what we found is that in many cases, they were very far from using all these advanced tools and were much more at a stage of digitizing many of their old processes. Even so, obviously, in every country, you find very interesting things that are also happening. So, for example, in terms of most countries now provide a lot of digital resources and actually a lot of open educational content to their students, etc. And many of them actually are really focused on digitizing their usual processes, rather than actually using AI or advanced technologies, and so you have almost no digital management tool that have actually AI-powered decision-making or recommendation-making tools. In many cases, they don't even have, dashboards. And one interesting example is for the low-stake national assessments. Most countries now have actually digitized their national assessments. And why I'm saying that is with no stake for students, things like PISA, but at the domestic level. But so what we found is overall, that a lot of the digital learning resources don't, have this AI. And when the things I've mentioned, the classroom analytics, for teachers, no country uses it in a mainstream way, and actually even experimental way. And even things like intelligent tutoring system, actually it has changed a little bit since the publication of the book, but overall it is something which is still a very relatively rare feature in many OECD countries at this stage. One of the way and the limitations of the use of that very much comes from teacher professional knowledge on AI, and here I'm talking really on the ability to use AI and digital tools as part of your pedagogy, not just the technical aspect of opening a computer or using a tool, that's and you can see that it is actually kind of mandatory in half of the countries in terms of pre-service teacher training, but and there are guidelines in more, so that you have a lot of countries that do have a push for having pedagogical digital competencies. But once you enter the profession, it is very optional and relatively rare that you have this kind of push. So that's really one of the obstacles to the adoption, in addition to what I just mentioned before, the availability and the social acceptance. And so a lot of countries do actually use the curriculum to try to foster actually the use of digital tools in education by the students. So basically, teachers have to use it as a way to foster their students' digital competencies. And you can see that, in most countries they are integrated as a transversal competency rather than giving it to having a distinct compulsory subject area in the topic. A few things that came out recently. So in France launched in February a pretty ambitious program where actually not only they have guidelines, but they're in the process of developing a sovereign AI to support teachers. Basically with the idea that it would support them to do lesson planning and student assessment, and that it would be aligned with the curriculum and the values, etc. They're also trying to assess AI through an extension of a mandatory tool that they already have, and a mandatory not text but test on digital skills for grades 8 and 10. And so they provide the training for that. And also they have a big rollout program on the use of generative AI for human resource management of the teachers. There are 1.2 million teachers in France. So that will be a way to allow the people who are in charge of the human resource management to focus on individual cases and leave all the more generic questions to a generative AI. Korea is another interesting example, where because they had a pretty comprehensive vision of their digital transformation, which included the working with the edtech sector, working with the teachers and doing a lot of professional training for that and having a great infrastructure for that. And basically they wanted to initially have a classroom evolution. Perhaps that was a little bit exaggerated as a way of phrasing it, but basically they have provided digital learning materials. They used to be textbooks, now they're learning materials, meaning that they are optional for the teachers, and which are basically intelligent tutoring systems, embarking some level of generative AI, and so that, providing tutoring to the students and providing feedback to the teachers. And I could have mentioned England as well. They have a very interesting content store for their education technology companies that allows them that provide a lot of materials in terms of curriculum, in terms of evidence, in terms of pedagogical strategies that allow the tech developers to do something which is aligned with the English curriculum and evidence about the English school system. So to conclude, we have, as I've mentioned initially, we have, and if you don't know them, you may want to have a look, developed these guidelines with Education International, which is the International Federation of Teacher Unions, and with the idea of providing jurisdictions with a kind of a good starting point to speak about their teaching profession. And you can see, they are organized in 4 different sections, providing access to digital ecosystem. And here we're talking also of the mainly, in fact, of the soft infrastructure, so the digital learning resources and tools, as well as teachers, skilled teachers who are actually able to use all these different things and while respecting the student and the teacher well-being. Then it's about things around incentives, so something around co-creation with teachers and students and end users, and also about regulations where there is nothing particularly new. It's about ethics, safety, transparency, explainability, preventing algorithmic bias, and having a human in the loop, human support, and having also human alternative. We have also developed literacy and AI literacy framework with the European Commission and code.org, which basically is going to be a line of feed PISA 2029 on AI and media literacy, which will be the innovative domain of PISA in 2029. And the consultation on it is still ongoing. So if you want to do give comments, so it is still possible. And really, it's organized around 4 competencies: engaging, creating, designing with, and managing AI. And so just to finish, and perhaps for our discussion, basically, what does that mean for, and especially the emergence of generative AI for education? So I think one of the aspects, as I've mentioned before, is to become clear about what is fundamental knowledge. So what are the things that we want students to know so that they can actually interact with these tools? And perhaps one way to do that is to have these dual modes of teaching, learning, and assessing with no generative AI and with also generative AI, and enriching the 2 different modules. Of course, there is already a revision of the assessment formats, with some people going back to paper and pencil or going to oral examinations. Of course, people can do digital exams with proctoring or design home assignments, where actually Gen AI allows to do much, much more than what would have been possible without it. And in terms of research, we really need a lot of bigger studies. Currently most of the studies don't have much statistical power, so that's a bit of a limitation. Some studies do confuse performance at the task and the learning. So, they don't actually they take the final achievement of the task as a proof of learning, which is no longer possible, and so that's a very important point to keep in mind. And also what we really miss is longer intervention, because most of the studies I've shown you are based on one interaction with one task, short. And the big question is what happens when we actually use it on a more continuous basis. And so that's really what we need to learn in the coming years. And finally, I would say, yes, we need also to know more about the educational generative AI tools and how they actually help to support learning. Last but not least, and that's more a question, to be negotiated, is basically here, I'm showing what colleague Inge Molinar has and colleagues have designed, in terms of the continuum between teacher working alone and teacher starts being totally automated. And so you can see you have a few in between. And the big question is actually, where do we want different teaching and learning tasks to sit, and at what stage? And to develop some kind of a common agreement on that. And so that really comes, with working together on defining different types of learning scenarios where we can integrate the AI tools in an intelligent way. And so I hope we can do that. And that, yes. And as I mentioned, we are also working on new types of guidelines, but this time for generative AI, which will actually echo some of the things that I just said. And finally, if you haven't checked them out yet, feel free to go on the OECD website to see the Digital Education Outlooks, which are available for free for download. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to have to take questions.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that. We have questions in both the chat and the Q&A, so I'll flip back and forth. One of the first questions posted was, a critical gap exists between rapid AI adoption and policy development in academia. How can we design an adaptive policy framework that effectively governs ethical risks like data privacy and biases, while empowering educators and guaranteeing equitable access for every student?
Well, I guess, that would be by having open frameworks, that are adaptable. I think that's right now, to me, the main challenge is not so much privacy, data protection, where in fact it is, we always talk about that, but it's pretty well regulated already. So now there is perhaps a question of enforcement, but it is regulated. For that, it very much relates to the final part of the questions, which is about equity and the provision. Because on that point, if you get your, let's say, access to a generative AI or AI tool via your school or your education system, then actually your privacy and data will be protected, because that they will do. If you use it by yourself in the evening and you use the free ChatGPT, then nothing of that is going to happen. So, that's a kind of a new challenge that people have. But to me, the main one is really how do we make sure that all students have, have access and learn about how to use these tools, but at the same time have access to pedagogies and teachers who know how to use them in a way that will make them learn something and not just perform the tasks that they were asked to do.
Following on from that and looking at competencies and students' competencies, how long does it take to bring students up to scratch, for instance, so that their ability to use AI is not it's not a differentiator between them and their ability to learn?
Well, I think that's again, that's really the big questions for teachers. So people are experimenting different things. One is, for example, to ask for more tasks that are derivatives of previous ones, because in fact, the generative AI is not very good at knowing what you've done before, so that, or at reflecting on what you have done, asking people to reflect on what were their, for example, cognitive strategy to reach a certain things. Another way to think is to put actually much more importance to personal expressions and opinions, so to provide an incentive. In fact, we have reached in education this stage where, well, the worst scenario would be that everything is fake, and which is fake, machine fake, in the sense that, the teacher provides lessons and assignments that were designed by ChatGPT. The students ask ChatGPT to do it, and then the teacher asks ChatGPT to mark the students' work and provide feedback on it, so that would be the worst. But in some ways, even so, in the human paradigm, there is something a little bit fake, in terms of what are the tasks that we ask the students to do to learn, what the students know they should be providing back to the teachers and perhaps it is time to think of how we break that and how we make the learning more authentic, the tasks more authentic and more engaging for the students. I think that's really one of the big challenges is that, so how do we make sure that people want to learn, so that's rather than just want to perform a task. And I think that some of the, working on, well, again, learning tasks that are actually more authentic, related to people's interest, trying to develop the creativity of the students by, making them do things that are a bit new to them and exciting, working on critical thinking, on empathy, etc., is becoming much more important than even more important than it used to be before. And so I think that really the pedagogies have to become much more intentional in integrating these aspects in the learning and in the teaching.
All right. Thank you. Another question is, obviously, thank you very much for a comprehensive presentation. If teacher professional development on AI focuses on helping them to generate lesson plans and provide feedback to students, how do we prevent teachers from falling prey to the same challenges of metacognitive laziness and over-reliance on AI?
Absolutely. That's exactly the same challenge for the teachers as it is for the students. There is a slight difference though, so generative AI is very much problematic for education because the performance in education is the learning, whereas in many other businesses, the performance is performing the task that you're supposed to do. And that's kind of true for the teachers, so let me take a metaphor, is that if you have a taxi driver, usually speaking, they know the city, etc., and they have a lot of knowledge, or they used to. And if you take, an Uber driver, then, they follow the GPS and they perform the task, with the help of the tool. So as a customer or as an employer, it may not make a huge difference to you whether, because at the end of the day, you go where you go, so that's, so I think the teachers, because we don't want, we want them, the continuation of a human relation, etc. But the teachers are not, we want them to continue to learn. We want them to actually, do a lot of the things that the machines cannot do. But they are more in the task performing mode than in the learning performing, possibly, so they could be seen like that for us from an employer perspective, and it's not the case with the students, so that's really there is a huge difference because of that between them, but you're absolutely right that it is the same, and it would be very pitiful if the teachers ended up to offload and be metacognitively lazy and offload everything to students. And for some aspects of it, because it would be ethically very problematic, because like I've mentioned the assessment case, I think that, it is a role of the teachers to provide feedback, assessment, advice, guidance, encourage the students. And if they don't do that and it's a machine doing it, then there is no point having teachers anymore, so that's
coming back to the study you were talking about at the very beginning with ChatGPT and stopping students at home from using it. Obviously, that's very difficult. So how were you able to ensure that one group did not have access to GPT at home?
So it's not my study. So there was, for example, the Slovenian study tried, to do that, and so it was both a commitment, so it was actually a commitment from the students on the one hand, but also regular verification, so that in fact every week they were asking whether they had done it, and in some cases they had to remove some of the students from the branch of their control, so that they controlled it. They spoke to them, and so to make sure that no, can you fully prevent it? Perhaps not, but yeah. So they've really tried their best to actually do that. In some of the other studies, it is controlled studies, when you just have to do a short task, so that's not difficult to control, in the case of the essay writing or in the case of the creativity. But of course, for the university course, and it is much more difficult. And so they had to do this kind of regular monitoring of what students were actually doing, and especially those in the control group.
One last question, because as we're running out of time, going right down to the minute. Since most studies seem to agree that the use of ChatGPT by students doesn't seem to improve learning and knowledge, is it possible that the way we measure learning through exam performance, for example, is not appropriate to measure ChatGPT's multidimensional outputs, brainstorming, feedback, explanation, which are all part of the learning process? So is it what we're doing to measure?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right in some ways, that we used to look at performance and output, the final product, as a proof of learning, that the process had been done. And probably now we have to put more emphasis on the process of learning and monitor more the process of learning rather than just the final output. So I think that's really one of the big changes now, and so there are different ways of doing that, portfolios, process folios, people thinking loud, etc. But it is kind of more time consuming, perhaps, so it requires to rebalance a little bit the time that we spend on doing different things. And so we have to find out what these new models are, but certainly we have to change our ways of assessing and put less emphasis on the final task. Even so, we want people to be able to use a generative AI and perform very well, because that's what they will be asked to do in the labor market as well.
Great. Thank you. Well, our time is up. Thank you very much. With obviously my high school French.
Thank you.
Beaucoup. We'll look forward to learning more. There'll be lots more questions in the chat. Thank you very much for a very engaging and informative talk.
Thank you very much.